August 1969. The disaffected Catholic population of the Bogside took to the streets to confront the Royal Ulster Constabulary in the wake of a Protestant apprentice boys' parade in the city. The violence, which was a manifestation of long-standing political grievances, was so extreme that in an unprecedented step, British troops were deployed into Derry. This decision by the British government under Prime Minister Harold Wilson was to shape the future of Northern Ireland for over 30 years.
They moved straight into one of the worst hit streets on the edge of the Bogside, carrying with them their ready-made barbed wire barricades and lining up in battle formation across the street where the air was foul with smoke and tear gas. The stones and petrol bombs ceased, and slowly the Bogside fighters approached the newly installed barbed wire barricades.
Using previously unseen archive footage, we reveal the inside story of what became known as the Battle of the Bogside. Northern Ireland, although part of the United Kingdom, had been ruled by a separate unionist government since 1921. Despite nationalists forming a significant majority in Derry, unionists manipulated the electoral system to secure power in local government and retain control of housing and employment. Nationalists blamed them for the widespread poverty and overcrowding in Catholic districts. In the months leading up to the battle, people had begun to take to the streets. They were demanding equality and democracy.
1968 was a remarkable year when there were outbreaks of disturbances and violence in so many countries. And in some ways, I think the Civil Rights Association that existed then, or was set up then, in Derry, was an offshoot of the general sort of disturbance, an air of disturbance that existed in other parts of the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would certainly hope that in conducting this march in our city, that we will act in a responsible manner.
When the civil rights movement deepened, and suddenly there was a whiff of victory in the air when we went marching, and the unionists tried to stop us, and the British ignored us, and the police were attacking us. There was a feeling that we were going to overturn the unionist government, and that crucially we would get full British rights. One has to stress again and again, we were not marching for a united Ireland. We were marching for the right to become full British citizens.
Well, as regards the 5th of October, rank and file police that I discussed that matter with felt that the police overreacted on that occasion. You know, this was a peaceful civil rights march, and okay, they were in breach of the order which banned them, but the consensus of opinion in the police, or any police that I spoke to about it, and most of these were Protestants, of course, said that was totally unnecessary, and showed us up in a very bad light.
I knew what was coming, and I also knew when people round the world got the sight of blood being spilt, demanding work, houses, and universal suffrage, that the genie would be out of the bottle, and the unionist system, as we knew it then, would come crashing down about their heads. And that's exactly what did happen.
I was a working class Protestant. That was my sort of social status, and that status led to my indignation, because when I was working in the city centre, I saw nationalists protesting to demand certain rights that I didn't have either. But it wasn't just that they were protesting about them. They were saying that I and people like me were denying them their rights when I didn't have them either.
January 1969. People's Democracy, a student-led civil rights group, set out on a march from Belfast to Derry to highlight inequalities across Northern Ireland. The organisers were aware that the march would be contentious and that it would be opposed by loyalist Protestants who saw it as an attack on the Northern Ireland state as a whole. At various points along the route, the marchers came under attack from loyalists. But it was at Burntollet Bridge, some 5 miles outside Derry City, that they came under the most serious assault. A loyalist crowd attacked the marchers while the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the B Specials, an auxiliary police force which had an infamous reputation amongst Catholics, looked on. The marchers arrived in Derry to a rapturous reception. But as news of the attack spread, rioting broke out in Derry city centre. In the early hours of the morning of the 5th of January, a group of RUC men entered the Bogside and proceeded to launch an attack on houses in the St Colum's Wells area, smashing windows and singing sectarian songs.
They were thumping the shields of their baton and they came marching down the hill. And what could we do? We all ran home.
Barricades were erected to keep the RUC out of the Bogside. It was on this night that John Caker Casey, a local resident, inscribed the legend, "You are now entering Free Derry," on the gable end of a house at the edge of the barricaded area. It was to be 5 days before the barricades were withdrawn and Free Derry was once more connected to the rest of the city. This was a decisive moment. Over the coming months, rioting intensified as nationalist youths determined to keep the RUC out of the area. The arguments of those prepared to condone the use of violence in the struggle for civil rights were to be significantly strengthened by the events of the 19th of April. As rioting against the police raged along William Street at the edge of the Bogside, a local resident, Sammy Devaney, had been watching the proceedings from his front doorstep.
Sammy Devaney was very well known in Derry, and he was very well known as a very fair person who was not really politically involved, as far as I know, with anybody or anything. Apparently what happened was that 3 or 4 young boys running away from the police ran in through Sammy's front door, ran through the house and escaped out over the back wall. And the police broke down the door, and I think 5 or 6 policemen went into the room and battered everybody in sight.
They beat her on the legs.
The assault on Devaney was carried out in front of his family. The following day, his daughter spoke out on national television about the attack. Her testimony sent shockwaves across Derry.
At all times, the only time they used their fists was on me, and one of them kicked my daddy in the corner of the room. One of the policemen. I didn't know it was my daddy at the time because the children were crying, and Freddie Budd, a neighbour, also came into the room beforehand, and he was on top of 2 of them, and I was on top of 2 of them.
What was to protect them?
To protect them, because we saw the police coming in the room. You know, once they'd kicked my daddy and we knew they would come in.
Well, I had never come across it before, and I don't think anybody else had either, where 5 or 6 policemen would break down someone's door and go in and severely hammer everybody in that house. I mean, as far as I can gather, there's no questions asked. Anybody that was there got beaten, and that included the children.
They then kicked my daddy from the corner of the settee right up on the middle of the floor, and his head was lying on the mat, face up, and they walked out, and I knelt down at my daddy, and I was really just praying over him. I thought he was dead. You know, after the beating that he had taken, I thought he never could survive it.
The awful thing was that the policeman, the officer, with his rod of office, a blackthorn stick, that was his rod of authority, stood there tapping it on the floor while his men almost beat a man to death.
Devaney died on the 17th of July 1969, less than a month before thousands of Protestant apprentice boys were due to march in the city. He was 43 years old. There was no doubt in the Bogside that his death was a result of the RUC beating. For many in Derry, Sammy Devaney was the first victim of the Troubles.